In this video, you'll gain a deeper understanding of Albert Camus' take on the myth of Sisyphus. Is Camus' notion of absurd freedom completely absurd? That's coming right up. Albert Camus lived from 1913 to 1960, 3 years before his untimely death in 1960 in a car accident. He actually won the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1957. This was for, quote, his important literary production, which with clear-sighted earnestness illuminates the problems of the human conscience in our times. Camus dug deep into human consciousness, and specifically the time right after World War II. People were searching for meaning, and Camus went deep into that quest with fiction books like The Stranger and nonfiction works like the one we're going to talk about today. We're going to actually look at the Myth of Sisyphus, the Justin O'Brien translation from the French. And if you want to reference that book or get it yourself, I'll provide a link down in the description below. Camus starts off the essay with this quote from Pindar, and it really frames what he's going to talk about and argue for in the essay. The quote is, "O my soul, do not aspire to immortal life, but exhaust the limits of the possible." That's a great quote because Camus is going to argue that given that there is no God and there's no hope for immortality or life after death, we need to accept that fate, that we're sentenced to a finite amount of time on earth, and then we need to just squeeze out as much as life as we can, test the bounds of what's possible given the time we do have here on earth. Now, Camus took suicide very seriously, and he actually thought that it posed a serious philosophical problem. And as he says here in this quote that I put into a slide, there is only one really serious philosophical problem, and that is suicide. Now you might think, wait, there are very important philosophical problems like ethics poses important problems concerning justice, what's right or wrong, but Camus thought most philosophical questions don't concern actual life or death. They're usually looking back and reporting on life and death situations and trying to figure out what was the right or wrong thing to do in that situation. But he thinks, as it says here, that I have never seen anyone die for the ontological argument for God's existence. On the other hand, I see many people die because they judge that life is not worth living. So the question is, what is the meaning of a life? What makes a life worth living? What gives it meaning? And people without meaning, he's actually seen them die for a want of meaning. Camus notes people commit suicide for many reasons. It's complex. He acknowledges that. But all suicides, he claims, acts as a confession. It's an act of confession. As he says in this quote, dying voluntarily implies that you have recognized, even instinctively, the ridiculous character of that habit of continuing to exist, the absence of any profound reason for living, the insane character of daily agitation, and the uselessness of suffering. So we find in our life that we repeat the same patterns over and over in this cycle, and our lives are often full of agitation, frustration, suffering, and it makes you wonder why is life worth living? And when someone commits suicide, it is a confession of that fact that life is sort of ridiculous in that sense when you zoom out and you view all this suffering and all this repetitive activity that seems to amount to nothing. Now, we have to be careful though, because I do want to be sensitive in this video and just note that there are people who suffer with suicidal thoughts and are really struggling with that. So if you do find yourself in that situation, know that I take that very seriously, and Camus does as well take the question of suicide very seriously. I personally have been impacted by suicide indirectly. I know two mothers, friends of our family, who have lost their sons to suicide unexpectedly and, quite frankly, without reason. That is, the family was left wondering why they did it. Also, I had a fellow grad student at my time in my PhD program commit suicide. It was very jarring and tragic for me. And if you find yourself struggling with suicidal thoughts, then you're not alone, and there is help. There's a helpline in the United States. If you're here, if you're somewhere else, I'm sure you have helplines as well. In the US, it's 800-273-TALK or 8255. Now, the next part of the essay is entitled Absurd Walls. And what does Camus mean by absurd walls? You're going to see what he means, but first we need to be clear on what is the absurd. That's a term that if you go out on the internet's commonly thrown around, but it's often not clearly used and clearly defined. So we need to define it as Camus is thinking of it. So as you can see here is an explanation of how I think Camus is thinking about what the absurd means. The absurd is that humans naturally seek value and meaning in their individual lives. We're sort of value and meaning creating creatures. We seek to live lives that have some kind of purpose and value. We seek meaning in things. We naturally look for patterns and try to interpret what those patterns mean and what they say about that thing that they're attached to. But we are, as it says there, yet we are thrown into a universe that affords no answers to those deepest questions concerning value and meaning. The cosmos is mute and irrational in this respect. That is, the universe described by natural science is ultimately without design and offers no answers to its meaning or the meaning of lives brought into its fold through the lottery of birth. So when we look into the universe, we try to look for what's natural to look for regarding value and meaning, we don't find any, and the cosmos itself, as described by natural science, offers no meaning and value. Now, the feeling of absurdity, so there's the absurd, which is that incongruency between our search for meaning and the lack of meaning or rationality in the universe. It affords no reasons in that regard. But there's also this feeling of absurd, and the absurdity of life, this feeling of the absurd, comes about when the familiar illusion of life is bulldozed. So remember the walls. The walls are the walls that we put up to insulate ourselves and to make ourselves feel comfortable in life. We simply ignore the big questions and we act as if life has meaning. But when those bounds of comfort are bulldozed over, you see life for what it really is. All of a sudden, you can see beyond the walls and you can see what life is really like, and all of a sudden you become a stranger. Instead of living in a cozy house with comfortable walls that you've constructed, you now are exposed and you become a stranger in the land, and the world is no longer a comforting place. It's an alien, stark wasteland. Life is really an exercise in futility. It's ultimately without meaning for Camus. Also, life becomes a mechanical cycle designed to help keep itself in existence. Once the walls are down and you see life for what it really is, and you realize it's without ultimate meaning, this can lead to sort of a crisis. There's a fork in the road that you come across. That is, you can either choose to quit living because life has no meaning, or you can choose to go on living. So you can embrace the absurd, or you can give up on living. Now, what is absurd freedom? This is the notion we talked about in the start of the video. Is this notion completely absurd? Well, let's look at it. So, Camus actually does an interesting reversal in his essay. He says suicide as a possibility makes us think life needs to have a meaning for it to be worth living, right? That was the whole point. What's the meaning of life? Well, if there is no meaning, then life isn't worth living, and maybe we should just commit suicide. But Camus realizes, quote, on the contrary, that it will be lived all the better if it has no meaning. Living an experience, a particular fate, is accepting it fully. Now, no one will live this fate knowing it to be absurd unless he does everything to keep before him that absurd brought to light by consciousness. Living is keeping the absurd alive, contemplating it. So if you're truly living, you keep the absurdity of life before you, that there is no ultimate meaning and that you can't look to the universe or God or anything for meaning. Instead, you need to fully embrace the experience that you've been given on this earth, and that is truly being alive. That is truly living. And trying to negate the absurd, as it says, as the existentialists did, by embracing freedom as an antidote to absurdity, is to destroy or ignore the very thing that is life and true freedom giving. Now, there's a distinction he draws between revolution and revolt. So, a revolution involves like a forcible overthrow and replacement of one thing with something new. Oftentimes, within a political context, it's the overthrow of one government and then it's replaced with another form of government. We can contrast that with a revolt. So a revolt is opposition to authority or dominance of one thing without replacing it with a new thing. So oftentimes you could just call it resistance. You resist the authority, you revolt against it, but you don't necessarily overthrow it and replace it with something else. Existentialists launch a revolution against the absurd. They seek to overthrow it and to replace it with something different. Again, I mentioned the notion of freedom, authenticity, faith in God, and so on. Whereas absurdists like Camus seek to revolt against the absurd. That is, to create some sort of resistance to the absurd that actually brings it within the fold and transforms it. So through that awareness and through that resistance, you can actually transform the absurd into something that gives life. Instead of running away from it or completely destroying it, you keep it before you, you resist it, and you keep on living in the face of it. And that, in and of itself, is true life and freedom giving. That is what he calls absurd freedom. Now, he thinks the existentialist approach is misguided as, quote, within the context of revolt versus revolution, to abolish conscious revolt is to elude the problem. One of the only coherent philosophical positions is thus revolt. It is a constant confrontation between man and his own obscurity. It is an insistence upon an impossible transparency. It challenges the world anew every second. Just as danger provided man the only unique opportunity of seizing awareness, so metaphysical revolt extends awareness to the whole of experience. That is, choosing to keep living. You are revolting against that which would be life-destroying. It is not aspiration, for it is devoid of hope. That revolt is the certainty of a crushing fate without the resignation that ought to accompany it. You're not resigned to living, but you're actually enlivened by that fact. You actually live life to its fullest in that position of revolt against the absurd. Now, there is consciousness plus revolt is to oppose suicide. So as Camus argues, everything that's indomitable, not able to be destroyed, and passionate in a human heart, quickens them, on the contrary, with its own life. It is essential to die unreconciled and not of one's own free will. Remember, the existentialists emphasize freedom of the will and other freedom conferring values and properties as things that give life meaning. But suicide is a repudiation. The absurd man can only drain everything to the bitter end and deplete himself. Remember the Pindar quote about testing the limits of what's possible. The absurd is his extreme tension. Remember, I mentioned that tension, which you know you're in revolt when you feel that tension, when you have the feeling of absurdity, which he maintains constantly by a solitary effort. For he knows that in that consciousness, being aware of it, and in that day-to-day revolt, he gives proof of his only truth, which is defiance. Now, absurd freedom, we can summarize, is freedom from false liberty, which is belief in a possible revolution against death, the finite time we've been given, the revolution being eternal life or life after death, or some form of freedom even, seeking to replace the reality of the absurd. Instead, the absurd person accepts the finality of death, lives conscious that one is a slave to a future that is final and ultimately without hope, and living free from such illusion results in a different kind of freedom. It's absurd freedom. It's freedom to fully embrace the finite time one has been given. It's freedom to suck the marrow from life, to fully embrace one's present experiences, instead of to try to bend one's life to a false future that one hopes exists. Now we can ask that question, is absurd freedom completely absurd? What do you think? Go ahead and leave your thoughts in the comments. Now, the absurd person he characterizes thus catches a sight of a burning and frigid, transparent and limited universe in which nothing is possible, but everything is given, and beyond which all is collapse and nothing. You only have what's in front of you. You can test the bounds of what's possible, but ultimately everything that you have is provided by life. And he can decide to accept such a universe and draw from it his strength, his refusal to hope, and the unyielding evidence of a life without consolation. But what does life mean in such a universe? Nothing else for the moment but indifference to the future and a desire to use up everything that is given. So if you look around you, you find that you've been given certain things in life. Life throws at you certain opportunities, relationships, and so on. And you can just take that as being given to you and then try to use it up, to fully enjoy it and embrace it. And by doing that, you are, in essence, acting and living in revolt to the absurd. Now we transition to the myth of Sisyphus, which some of you may be familiar with. I'll give a Reader's Digest version of that myth. Basically, Sisyphus defied the gods and did all sorts of bad things. So the gods condemned Sisyphus to an eternal punishment in Hades. And as the Greek myth goes, which we'll talk about in a minute, he was condemned to roll a rock up a hill for eternity, only to have that rock not make it to the top and come tumbling back down, and he have to return back down and repeat the cycle over and over again. Now for Camus, Sisyphus represents the absurd person. Why does Camus think this? And why does Camus think we must imagine Sisyphus happy? That famous quote, we must imagine Sisyphus happy. In fact, I even created at the Philosophical Life store a canvas print of it. So if you're interested in that, if that is something you want, which is kind of cool, you can go get that in the link down below to our Philosophical Life store. So we need to start out in noting Camus takes an approach to Greek myths that they're things that are not set in stone, that the Greeks had it all figured out with regard to the myths that they illuminated. Rather, Camus thinks myths are dynamic. They're not static, and they're open to interpretation and transformation. And Camus pulls out of the myth of Sisyphus something he thinks is present but often overlooked. Now, what is present but often overlooked? Well, let's again go through what is going on with Sisyphus. So he pushes that stone that I mentioned up the slope, only to have it fall back down. And then he has to go back down and repeat the cycle. So what you have here is the archetypal example of an activity that ultimately is without point. There's no point to him rolling the rock up the mountain and down the mountain again, at least from an objective perspective. It never amounts to anything. It's just a cycle that keeps repeating. Now, the analogy that we have to have in the background is our lives. So as I mentioned, life is cyclical, and we often find ourselves just simply doing the same things over and over again. And you might wonder if that itself ever amounts to anything, if there's any ultimate meaning to all of our activity, or is it just really like Sisyphus? We have our stones and we roll them up a hill. For instance, you might even think my whole life I roll up a stone up a hill, and then I hand it off to the next generation, all my accomplishments and achievements, only to have them maybe lose the grip and to have it come rolling back down. That is, at some point, my accomplishments will come rolling back down, and someone else can either pick them back up and put them back up the mountain, or they get off, as often is the case, lost and forgotten. In 100 years, most of us will not be remembered, and most of our accomplishments will not be remembered. You only have a vague recollection of your great-great-grandparents and the lives they lived, but their lives were rich and full of all sorts of activities and events and relationships, but you'll never have access to that. Now, Camus imagines that the true torture for Sisyphus, as condemned by the gods, occurs when Sisyphus is aware of his fate. So he thinks the physical torture of having to constantly roll this heavy stone up the hill only to have it fall back down and then have to do it again is not where the torture lies. The true torture is psychological. As Camus eloquently states, quote, "Where would his torture be indeed if at every step the hope of succeeding upheld him? The workman of today works every day in his life at the same tasks, and this fate is no less absurd." So here's that analogy I was drawing just a minute ago. But it is tragic only at the rare moments when it becomes conscious. Sisyphus, proletarian of the gods, powerless and rebellious, knows the whole extent of his wretched condition. It is what he thinks of during his descent. The lucidity, the awareness, that was to constitute his torture at the same time crowns his victory. Now you can start thinking back to what we were talking about earlier, the absurd freedom. That is, living conscious and aware of your fate, that it's pointless, that it's hopeless, that it's meaningless ultimately, and yet choosing to keep living, choosing to keep doing activities instead of stopping living or committing suicide. Now, Camus does have a beef with existentialists that I mentioned earlier. He thinks ultimately this is where existentialists got things wrong, that they betrayed their own starting points by arguing from the absurdity of life to some sort of meaning in life. Schopenhauer, Kierkegaard, Nietzsche, and Tolstoy all ended up positing that there was some sort of meaning in life. So they took the absurdity of life, created a revolution against it to overthrow it with some sort of meaning in life. Camus thinks they were misguided and that they betrayed their own starting points, and what they needed to do was not overthrow the absurd, but instead live in revolt of it, and to find that tension is actually where freedom is found. Now, Camus walks a tightrope. He embraces the absurdity of existence while trying to avoid what he calls falling back into, quote, the spirit of nostalgia that plagued the existentialists. He thought the existentialists fell back into some sort of nostalgia about life having meaning, and they forgot the gravity of the absurd. How does he do this? Well, let's take a look. The Stanford Encyclopedia article on this subject actually does a good job, and I'll have a link to that article down below, does a good job talking about this. So he said, Sisyphus demonstrates that we can live with, quote, the certainty of a crushing fate without the resignation that ought to accompany it. That's quoting Camus, which I talked about earlier. For Camus, Sisyphus reminds us that we cannot help seeking to understand the reality that transcends our intelligence, striving to grasp more than our limited and practical scientific understanding allows, and wishing to live without dying. Like Sisyphus, we are our fate, and our frustration is our very life. We can never escape it. And the quote continues and connects this to happiness. This is where we circle and land on happiness. Rejecting any hope of resolving that strain is also to reject despair. Indeed, it is possible within and against these limits to speak of happiness. Here's a quote from Camus. Happiness and the absurd are two sons of the same earth. They are inseparable. Now, it's not that discovering the absurd leads necessarily to happiness, but rather that acknowledging the absurd means also accepting human frailty and awareness of our limitations, and the fact that we can't help wishing to go beyond what is possible, to push the limits of what's possible, to reference the Pindar quote. These are all tokens of being fully alive. And then they quote the Myth of Sisyphus, the struggle itself toward the heights is enough to fill man's heart. One must imagine Sisyphus happy. So happiness ultimately comes from accepting our limits, and then still, in the face of accepting those limits, striving to be all we can be and accept the gifts we've been given from the earth and from this existence that we've been thrown into through the lottery of birth. And when we accept those limits, we can actually achieve some kind of happiness. And we need to live in that tension in order to be reminded of just how precious this time that we've been given really is. And by doing that, he thinks, looking at the myth of Sisyphus, seeing him still rolling the stone up and down the hill, we must imagine he's happy. He keeps living. He keeps rolling his stone, and there's a sense in which he has taken ownership of his fate. That is, he has achieved the absurd victory. So instead of looking to the universe for meaning that's not forthcoming, or looking past the universe to a God for meaning, which Kierkegaard did, he thought ultimately faith in God is where the meaning of life comes from, one looks to the earth and one's limited days as offering innumerable worlds to explore. So even Sisyphus with his rock, there are worlds within that rock that he owns. That is, once he takes ownership of his fate, he's able to see that there are many worlds to explore, if only psychologically, because physically he's still condemned to a repetitive activity that, at least objectively speaking, never amounts to anything. In this way, one takes ownership of one's fate, just as Sisyphus took ownership of his fate, and he, quote, teaches the higher fidelity or truth that negates the gods and raises rocks. He too concludes that all is well. This universe, henceforth, without a master, seems to him neither sterile nor futile. Each atom of that stone, each mineral flake of that night-filled mountain, it itself forms a world. That becomes a world to explore for Sisyphus. In being satisfied with his fate, through embracing it, he overcomes the suffering and torment the gods intended to inflict on him. Instead, he transforms it into satisfaction and happiness. So the moral of the story is, though life is ultimately without meaning, and it seems an exercise in futility, according to which all our efforts and accomplishments don't amount to anything lasting, we can embrace this limited time we've been given and take satisfaction in having rocks to roll. Now let's turn to an important question. Why is satisfaction and happiness that we must assume and imagine Sisyphus possessing not something that makes his life have meaning? Now, you may recall, we can't negate the absurd, but you might wonder, now that Sisyphus has happiness in his life, he's taken ownership of his fate, and he lives fully conscious of its absurdity, why is that state, that revolt against the absurd, and to continue living and to keep rolling his rock, why is that not the source of meaning? If only a subjective source, that is the psychological state of happiness and satisfaction, why doesn't that give his life meaning? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Do you think it's the case that someone can live a happy life and yet have a life completely without meaning? If so, I'd love to hear some examples of that. And as always, keep living the philosophical life and keep rolling your rocks, and I'll try to do the same myself.